Good afternoon, everyone. There are stories that have been told and retold for generations, and not just in the parts of the world that you know about, but all over the world, in different languages and in different cultures. They are told all over the world because they're parts of the stories that are enduring, the ideas, the mysteries, the excitement. Lots of young people appreciate and enjoy hearing them all over the world. In the early 1800s, two brothers in Denmark called in Europe rather, called the Brothers Grimm, recorded their stories in writing so that people could circulate them and read them to their children. One of these stories is called Sleeping Beauty, and it is not just written down as a story in books. There is a ballet called Sleeping Beauty. There are classical music pieces called Sleeping Beauty. There have been cartoons about Sleeping Beauty, and there have also been movies, especially the one made by Walt Disney. Here's the story of the Sleeping Beauty. In times past, there lived a king and queen who said to each other every day of their lives, "Would that we had a child!" And yet they had none. It happened one day that when the queen was bathing, a frog came out of the water and squatted on the ground and said to her, "Thy wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year is gone by, you shall bring a daughter into the world." And as the frog foretold, so it happened. The queen bore a daughter so beautiful that the king could not contain himself for joy, and he ordained a great feast. Not only did he invite his relations, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women, that they might be kind and favorable to the child. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he only had 12 golden plates for them to eat from, one of them could not be invited. However, the feast was celebrated with all splendor, and everyone had a wonderful time. And as it drew to an end, the wise women stood forward to present the child their wonderful gifts. One bestowed virtue, one beauty, a third riches, and so on. Whatever there was in the world to wish for, the princess got it. And when 11 of them had said their say, in came the uninvited 13th, burning with revenge. Without greeting or respect, she cried with a loud voice, "In the 15th year of her age, the princess shall prick herself with a spindle and shall fall down dead." And without another word, she turned away and left the hall. Everyone was terrified at her speech. Then the 12th wise woman came forward to bestow her gift. Though she could not do away with the evil prophecy, she could soften it. So she said, "The princess shall not die, but shall fall into a deep sleep for 100 years." Now the king, desiring to save his child even from this misfortune, gave orders that all the spindles in his kingdom and spinning wheels should be burned up. The maiden grew up, adorned with all the gifts of the wise women, and she was so lovely, modest, sweet, kind, and clever that no one who saw her could help but love her. It happened one day, when she was 15 years old, that the king and the queen rode abroad, and the maiden was left behind alone in the castle. She wandered about into all the nooks and corners and into all the chambers and parlors as her fancy took her. At last she came to an old tower. She climbed the narrow winding stair to a little door with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key and the door opened. And there in the room sat an old woman with a spindle, diligently spinning her flax. Good day, mother, said the princess. What are you doing? I am spinning, answered the old woman, nodding her head. What thing is that twists around so briskly? Asked the maiden, and taking the spindle into her hand, she began to spin. No sooner had she touched it than the evil prophecy was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. In that very moment, she fell back upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep fell upon the whole castle. The king and queen, who had returned and were in the great hall, fell fast asleep, and with them the whole court. The horses in their stalls and the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, the flies on the wall, the very fire that flickered on the hearth became still and slept like the rest. The meat on the spit ceased roasting, and the cook who was going to pull the scullion's hair for some mistake he had made let him go and fell asleep. The wind ceased, and not a leaf fell from the tree about the castle. Then around and about that place there grew a hedge of thorns, thicker every year, until at last the whole castle was hidden from view, and nothing of it could be seen but the vane on the roof. And a rumor went abroad in all that country of the beautiful sleeping Rosamond, for so was the princess called. And from time to time, many kings' sons came and tried to force their way through the hedge, but it was impossible for them to do so. The thorns held fast together like strong hands, and the young men were caught by them, and not being able to get free, they died a lamentable death. Many a long year afterwards, there came another king's son into the country. He heard an old man tell how there was a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that a beautiful enchanted princess named Rosamond had slept there for 100 years, and with her the king and queen and the whole court. The old man had been told by his grandfather that many kings' sons had tried to pass the thorn hedge, but had been caught and pierced by the thorns and had died a miserable death. Then said the young man, nevertheless, I do not fear to try. I shall win through and see the lovely Rosamond. The good old man tried to dissuade him, but he would not listen to his words or anyone else's. But now the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come when Rosamond should be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it was changed into a hedge of beautiful large flowers, which parted and bent aside to let him pass, and then closed behind him in a thick hedge. He reached the castle yard, and he saw the horses and brindled hunting dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons sitting with their heads under their wings. And when he came indoors, he saw the flies asleep on the wall, and the cook in the kitchen with his hand uplifted to strike the scullion, and the kitchen maid with the black fowl on her lap, ready to pluck. He mounted higher and saw in the hall the whole court lying asleep, and above them on their thrones slept the king and queen. He went farther, and all was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. At last he came to the tower and went up the winding stair and opened the door of the little room where Rosamond lay. And when he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn away his eyes. He stooped and kissed her, and she awakened and opened her eyes and looked very kindly on him. She rose, and they went forth together, and the king and the queen and the whole court woke up and gazed on one another with great eyes of wonderment. The horses in the yard got up and shook themselves. The hounds sprang up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof drew their heads from under their wings, looked around, and flew into the field. The flies on the wall crept on a little further. The kitchen fire leaped up and blazed and cooked the meat. The joint on the spit began to roast. The cook gave the scullion such a box on the ear that he roared out, and the maid went on plucking the fowl. The wedding of the prince and Rosamond was held in all splendor, and they lived very happily together until their lives' end. And sometimes those fairy tales end with, and they lived happily ever after. You might have heard some variations of that story, but basically, that's it. Sometimes it's said that the curse included that the blessing of the 12th wise woman included that she would be woken up by a man who loved her for her beauty. Night now.